Welcome to Double Trouble, a series under Macdonald-Laurier Institute's Inside Policy Talks, generously supported by Konrad-Adenauer Foundation's Canada office. I'm your host, Dr. Balkan Devlen. I'm a senior fellow and a director of the Transatlantic Program here at MLI. And I am today very happy, very pleased to join by George Takach, who has a great book, which we will talk about in a minute, called Cold War 2.0. And looks at the emerging Cold War between the West and Russia and China, and particularly the role of artificial intelligence and other advanced technologies in this new version of the Cold War. George, thank you very much for coming to Double Trouble.
Balkan, it's a real pleasure to be on, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, and likewise, and I'm pretty sure our viewers and listeners will actually enjoy this episode quite a lot. Let me start by asking you just to give a little bit of a background about yourself to our listeners, and what what made you write this book in this point in time.
So I practiced law for about 40 years at a major Canadian law firm, McCarthy Tétrault, and I was doing technology law for my entire career. So I'm very conversant in innovation, technology, those sorts of subjects. And it was for me in 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine the first time and annexed Crimea, that a big light bulb went off in my brain. Before law school, I had done a lot of international relations academics. I have a master's degree from the Patterson School at Carleton. But then I fell in love with technology on a summer job with Nortel. And so instead of going into the Foreign Service, I went into a legal career. But as I say, in 2014, it all came together: the technology, the international relations, the legal indignation that this could happen in 2014. And Balkan, I got to tell you, what was really the driving force was, because I'd worked in technology for 35 plus years by that point, we had better technology in the West. And so I kept asking myself, why is the democratic response to Putin so weak? And right about that time as well, 2014, 2015, you may recall Xi Jinping and China was starting to get very aggressive in the South China Sea. They were just starting some of the crackdowns in Hong Kong. And they were continuing their actions against Taiwan, the cognitive warfare, the gray zone, near military activities. And again, on all these fronts, I kept saying, we can do better than this. And I thought that a book that called it for what it is, a Cold War, because these two powers are increasingly not complying with the rules-based international order, that a book like that could help the democracies kind of gather around their leadership and a couple of ideas around pushing back. And so that was really the genesis for the book, but I didn't write it until the full-scale invasion in 2022, when Putin attacked the entire country of Ukraine. Then I said, okay, I can't put it off anymore. I've got to start ringing the bell and banging the drum.
No, I think that's a very important highlight, in the sense that this conversation need to be brought to the broader public, and not only among those who are particularly paying attention to international affairs, like yourself and myself. That our populations need to understand what we are getting into, and I think having that book out there, in terms of laying the ground for and understanding the framework for what the next decades would bring, is going to be essential if the West broadly, but also within Canada specifically, if we will start doing the things that is necessary to prepare ourselves as a deepening and getting colder Cold War, hoping that it will not turn hot. On one note, we are recording today on March 22nd, and just this week, Kremlin announced that your alma mater and an institution that I'm also affiliated with as a general research professor, NIPSIA, Norman Patterson School of International Affairs, is declared undesirable organization in Russia. Macdonald-Laurier Institute was declared back in August 2022 an undesirable organization, again by Kremlin. And this week, Kremlin decides both the Monk School in the University of Toronto and Norman Patterson School of International Affairs here at Carleton University are also, designated as undesirable. So our colleagues there must be doing something good and right to have the ire of Kremlin.
Well, I don't want to make it about me, Balkan, but I did deliver an address at the Monk School about a week and a half ago. I spoke at NIPSIA on this very topic. So maybe they're following me around, but I would consider it an honor of the highest degree to be sanctioned by the Kremlin, because to your point a minute ago, I couldn't agree more. You hear this phrase in Canadian politics, nobody ever got elected by, at the door, election time, talking up foreign policy. Well, let's change that. I would be absolutely delighted if on the streets of, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, when MPs and ministers and Justin Trudeau is out knocking on his doors, people come to the door and say, oh, by the way, why isn't Canada taking Cold War 2.0 more seriously? I would love that to be happening because, frankly, without public support, it's going to be very, very difficult to turn things around in this country. Poland, I'm in love with. They've got it. The Zeitenwende in Germany, they're waking up. South Korea, like everybody's getting it, except our own country, which is unfortunate. So you're doing your part, I'm doing my part, and if the Russians kind of validate that for us with their announcements, I think that's not a bad thing.
No, not at all. I mean, I had that honor back in April 2022 when Kremlin sanctioned me along with a couple other MLI senior fellows because of our support for Ukraine and pushing back against Russian revanchism and aggression. So our adversaries are taking note, and I think it's important that our politicians also started to show the leadership. And
right.
As you pointed out, the conversation is changing. Recently on Monday, I had the pleasure of moderating a panel that celebrated the 25th anniversary of Poland, Hungary, and Czechia's membership in NATO. And we had a couple. We actually had three members of parliament, two liberals and a conservative, and there was a cross-party agreement, for instance, about the need to do more, to increase our defense spending, get to the 2%. The public is slowly getting there. We see it in the surveys. I think what we need right now is political leadership to take the courage and not hide behind excuses of no, the public doesn't want it. Well, the public is there. There is cross-party support. I think it's time for leadership, which I want to get towards the end of it, and want to ask you on this. What our political leaders could do in terms of pushing this ahead and making Canada more secure. But I think you want to jump in here, and then I'll.
I just wanted to say something. You mentioned the 2%. So this notion that after the 2014 invasion and annexation of Crimea, NATO got together and said, look, 2% of GDP really ought to be the base. In my view, that's the base for 2014. For 2022, the new Polish president is talking about 3%. I think that's a serious number. And listen, I'm not a warmonger. people are starting to think, oh, well, gee, we didn't know George was really into all this military stuff. It pains me to say that we're in a Cold War. Last year, the numbers are now in 2023, about $800 billion extra were spent on defense in the democracies, relative to where we were before 2022, $800 billion. That's money that could have gone, should have gone, education, pensions, healthcare, you name it. But at the same time, we have to be realistic about what we're facing. And it's an insurance policy. And right now, we are underinsured in this country and in a number of other countries. So, yes, we can talk about some specifics. But the one thing I did want to get to, and I know you wanted me to get to, is the Cold War 2 is pretty clear, but why 2.0? So
I mean,
maybe,
that's exactly what I wanted to get, and I think I would definitely want to get back to the national security premium and why we need to pay it now. And if we don't
right,
pay it now, if we don't want to pay pennies today, we will pay
right,
hundreds of dollars in the future, and why
right.
this is essential. I mean, the old saying, "Si vis pacem para bellum," if you
Yeah,
want peace, prepare for war, um, is true today as it was during the Roman Empire. So we really need to be sort of paying attention to it. And I want to get back to at the end of our conversation about what could be the concrete steps that we can take to prepare Canada and to defend our own freedoms and prosperity as well. But I want to get back to the book. Could you give the listeners, the viewers, like a 3-4 minute overview of the central arguments and central flashpoints that you highlighted within the book, and
right.
why we need to pay attention to that, and why, as you pointed out, it's 2.0 that we're talking about today?
Yeah, so we've talked about the Cold War part, the two leading autocracies not complying with the rules-based international order. And I actually, in the book at the front end, go into some civics. What is the difference between a democracy and an autocracy? So for all the parents out there who have, 14, 15-year-olds, and maybe they're not getting enough civics in school, it's a great book because in a couple of chapters, it's very straightforward, simple. And bottom line, an autocrat that doesn't believe in the rule of law domestically sure isn't going to believe in a rules-based international order. So that's the Cold War part. The 2.0 part is an understanding and a realization that technology is now so central, frankly, to everything in society, but for sure for economic strength and growth and power and military power. So what I do in the book is I specifically focus on artificial intelligence at some length and the semiconductor chips that are required to support artificial intelligence. And then a new kind of computing that's really starting to come on called quantum computing, because it's going to be, well, it's, as I say, it's already out there, it's already solving problems, but it's just at the early stage. And then I talk about biotechnology because we're actually using technology to change our very bodies. And these 4 technologies are going to be critical to how Cold War II plays out. So it's Cold War 2.0. And here's the good news in the book, Balkan, so that if people have listened this far, hopefully all the depressing part about, oh, it's a Cold War, particularly for the older viewers who remember Cold War I and it was no picnic. But here's the good news. The good news is that democracies do innovation and they do technology far better than the autocracies for structural reasons. And again, I don't want to get into all the details, but there's a separate chapter on this. And you'll finish that chapter feeling very, very good about the democracies and our freedoms and how those freedoms generate new innovation, new technology, always something coming along. And that's precisely what's shut down in the autocracy. So going back to 2014, and again, I'm in the middle of a technology ecosystem, and I'm saying we do this so much better than they do it. Why aren't we prevailing right now in 2014? So that, as I say, is a good news story. But what I do in the book, in 5-6 chapters, is in quite some detail prove my point how the West is superior. And it's both politically, we do better with gender equality. If you keep half of your workforce from helping with innovation, you're just not going to do well. We do better on immigration. We do better on sort of social integration. So we've got the tools. We then now have to translate that power and that innovative capability into geopolitical results. And so in the last 4 chapters of the book, I talk about what you referred to a minute ago is, what are the things, the practical things that we have to do to make sure that we prevail in Cold War II, just as we prevailed, and again, good news story, in Cold War I.
No, I think that is excellent, because I want to get to those what those recommendations are. But a way of getting there, in a way, I always say that I have this rule of thumb, when you talk about the sort of the very dynamic nature and open nature of our system, and how that actually provides a lot of advantages for us. I always have this rule of thumb: if you want to understand the country's uh, system and its attractiveness, look at whether people are dying trying to get in or dying trying to get out. And no one is dying to get into China or Russia. And I think that tells you everything you need to know about which ones, which countries, which systems, despite whatever the problems we might have here in the West, that actually is inspirational and that people aspire to be part of, and that gives in the long term a big advantage for us. But what is, before getting into what we need to do to harness this this advantage from our society, from our technological base, from our knowledge base, institutions, etc. From your point of view, what seems to be the primary obstacle for the West to harness these number of advantages that you highlighted?
Well, right now, because you mentioned it's March 22, 2024, and I do talk about some American politics in the book, because the election in November, I'm 66 years old, and it is by far the most consequential election in my lifetime anywhere in the world. And it is a fundamental concern of mine that the Republican Party, starting with Donald Trump, but many others are now on the same page, this notion that the United States can go it alone, that they can cut themselves off from Europe, whether it's NATO, whether it's the Pacific, and they can build, some big walls around California and the Atlantic coast, and they can just isolate themselves. And Balkan, you and I have studied history, and we know we've seen this movie before. But what I try to do in the book is explain, particularly to Americans, which is why I have an American publisher, frankly. If you just look at semiconductor chips, which are, the most critical technology today in the world, bar none. NVIDIA and AMD, which are 2 American companies, they design the leading chips. Oh, and by the way, chips, for those of you who aren't up the curve, anything at home or in your car or at the office, anything that you turn on and off and runs on electricity, it has some chips running in the background. And so you need these chips for your smartphones, your computers. If you're in the military, you need them for your missiles, your precision guided weapons, for intelligence, for the satellites, like you name it. And the chips now, the very high-end ones, support artificial intelligence, which is going to be a huge wave in and of itself. So There's a company called NVIDIA, now worth $2.3 trillion in market cap, just astounding. And AMD, the number 2 company, whose CEO, by the way, is female. Very important to note. So those 2 companies design the chips in California, as does Apple. But those chips are made in Taiwan by a company called TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. But the machine that TSMC uses to make those chips is actually made in Holland, in the Netherlands. And the 2 most important components of that machine are made in Germany, the laser and the optics. And all the raw materials for the wafers and so on for the chips, well, those all come from Japan. So just looking at a slice of this Cold War 2.0 world and the importance of technology, the Americans cannot do semiconductor chips or AI on their own. So the phrase that I love to repeat, and I've used it in my legal career on projects and so on, actually comes from Dwight Eisenhower, the US president in the 50s. None of us is as strong as all of us. And that's why we need a strong NATO. One of the thoughts I have in the book is to expand NATO to GATO, a general alliance treaty organization, and include South Korea, include Japan, include the Philippines, Australia, and so on. So in my view, we've got to get stronger through alliances. And it's this very, very mistaken view in the Republican Party that now is the time to isolate ourselves. And so I've got to tell you, and which is why I wanted the book out now, so that hopefully I can change a few minds, even in the US. But if Trump gets in, I'm very, very worried that the isolationist tendency, could have an impact on how Cold War 2.0 plays out. Because if he thinks he can go it alone, I'm not sure that's going to end well.
No, I don't think it will end well for anyone, for that matter. And I couldn't agree more in terms of that we need to layer up sort of our defenses in a way, and the cooperation of different alliances. We can think of them as more concentric circles, overlapping different lattice work of alliances across the global West. That is, may take the form of what we like to call here in the institute minilateral attitudes and minilateral organizations such as AUKUS or the Quad or similar setups, but that actually coordinate and work together to be able to strengthen the existing rules and frankly to protect our security and our prosperity. And I think our populations particularly need to come to the terms with the fact that the old adage of guns versus butter is a false dichotomy. That is, you cannot preserve your prosperity and increase your well-being and your welfare if you do not have the means to be able to defend yourself across the board with these emerging trends. And I think that is a very important message to go. But I want to get into the technology part of it a little bit more, and maybe get a little bit in the weeds before we switch to, so what should we do? You already started talking about that a little bit. For those who are interested in, of course, a couple of years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, the Chip Wars is an excellent book to understand the whole semiconductor manufacturing and the geopolitics and the technology of it. But you have decades of experience and expertise on the technology law component. How effective you see the export controls and coordination between allies, the U.S., Netherlands, Taiwan, Japan, Germany, etc., when it comes to controlling high-end technology and intellectual property and how can we protect that? How effective are the mechanisms from regulatory side, from law side, that U.S. and others are putting together, keeping in mind that humans are always the failure point. Case in point, the Winnipeg lab. You might have all the things up there, but if you're not really following it through, your intellectual property, including things on very high level, biomaterial and information about it, can actually seep out, and our adversaries can get their hands on. How do you see the existing mechanisms that the West is developing, United States, through export controls, but also coordination? How effective they are in terms of ensuring that we maintain the edge on technology in these important areas?
So a couple of thoughts on that. And there is, towards the back end or back third of the book, a discussion of export controls and sanctions on technology. The Biden administration, in October of 2022, I often say, and I make this argument in the book, that two critical things happened in 2022. One was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's the bad news story. The good news story: in October of 2022, the Biden administration brought in a sanctions policy effectively to stop the flow of high-end semiconductor chips and this is the critical part, the equipment that makes high-end semiconductor chips, to stop those from going to China. And it could always be enforced more effectively. We have to do better. We have to use AI, actually, to help on the enforcement side. Why has Armenia bought 20 of these machines when they've never bought them before? And they're probably going to go through Central Asia and end up, somewhere in Moscow or Beijing. So we've got to do that better. But here's the good news, particularly with the equipment. In the book, I talk about Cold War I, because, again, if you were born after 1980 or so, it's all history instead of memory. And in Cold War I, the Americans invented the atom bomb and dropped it on Japan to end the Second World War. And the Russians came out with their atom bomb fairly soon thereafter, because they stole all the plans from the Americans. And I have images in the book, some pictures, and I have a picture of the American bomb and the Russian bomb, and they're very similar. But Balkan, here's the fascinating element of the current Cold War. The Chinese scientific community actually has units of these machines that make these chips, but they're so damn complicated that they just don't know how to reproduce one. So they can reverse engineer or attempt that, but they haven't been able to do it. And it's not just these machines. Aircraft engines, civil aircraft engines. I talk in the book about alliances, which you mentioned earlier, as being another real comparative advantage of the democracies. And think about it. If politically you need to work with others, as you have to do in a democracy, then you're predisposed to work with other countries much more effectively. You're used to it. So China and Russia, a number of years ago, like 10 years ago, tried to create a commercial airliner to compete with Boeing and Airbus. And the Chinese would do the fuselage and the wings and so on, but the Russians would bring their engine technology. Well, the deal fell apart. The Russians didn't trust the Chinese. They thought China was just going to rip off the technology, which is what they did to the Japanese with the high-speed trains that run all over China. So the CR, China-Russia 919, became the C919. It's out, and they're flying test flights around Hong Kong and so on. The Chinese make the fuselage, the Chinese make the wings. The engines come from General Electric. The avionics all come from American sources. Like all the critical tech stuff comes from the democracies. To your point on export controls, we should shut that down. We should just shut that down. If they're not going to play with our rules-based international order framework, then why should we share this critical technology with them? We just shouldn't do it. So we have to get stronger and smarter. Now, the one area for 2.0 that, again, is fascinating, because this is unprecedented. You see, in Cold War I, the Soviet Union and the United States, or the Soviet Union and Western Europe, didn't really have that much of an economic integration point. Today, walk into any Walmart, and 50, 60% of the merchandise on the shelves is made in China. Now, it's low tech, but it's a huge volume of trade. And it has pulled 600, 700, 800 million people in China out of poverty because they've taken jobs making all that stuff for Walmart. So how is this degree of economic integration going to play out in Cold War 2.0? What I propose at the end of the book is a decoupling, but just a technology decoupling. I don't have a problem with shower curtains made in China being sold in North America or Europe. I do have a problem with our jet engines being shared with the Chinese, and we don't get anything in return by way of behavioral changes or amendments in their, MOs. So
No, I totally agree. I mean, the importance here that we still have, as you pointed out, significant leverage when it comes to, especially on high tech and intellectual property issues. We started to use it, CHIPS Act, as you pointed out, and export controls, but we need to expand that and think more comprehensively about our cooperation between any Chinese entity when it involves high technology, biotechnology, synthetic biology, artificial intelligence, quantum, critical minerals, all those other things that are actually going to be essential. And because we know, and everybody knows, that the IP theft is a thing, economic espionage is a thing, and we need to wake up and use our leverage when we still have that particular leverage. So I think that's a very important lesson.
Sorry, and it's starting. So you may have noticed in January, so 3 months ago, the federal government in Ottawa brought in new rules for scientific researchers, typically at Canadian universities, and they listed about 100 entities, mainly in China, but some in Russia and some in Iran, which is very interesting, and said, look, if you're getting funding from a federal funding source, you can't work with these people in certain areas. And what really brought this home, about a year and a half ago, 2 scientists in England were working with counterpart scientists in Iran on the navigation systems for the Shahed drones. And, Balkan, you would think that anybody by 2022, 2023,
how is it even?
It's astounding that, we need a rule to tell someone, by the way, don't give rope to the guys with which they hang us. Like, that's just off limits. So it's starting, and it's starting to percolate through, the establishment. But, reading the press reports the last few weeks on the biotech situation in Winnipeg, again, it's just astounding, and how slowly the Canadian bureaucracy moves to take steps on these issues. I mean,
this
and
actually,
it's got to start from the top. I don't know.
Yeah, that's exactly where I want to get as the last question. So particularly here in Canada, what do we need to do to prepare ourselves, our institutions, our public, our population, our policies and regulations and our policymakers for this new Cold War 2.0?
So The first step is just our mindsets have to change. You know, when Cold War I ended, 1989, 1991, in those 2-3 years, there was this peace dividend and this thought that, you know, it was the end of history. Oh, we're done. Everybody's gone. Liberal market, democracy, end of story. That's no longer the case. So, in my view, from the top down, the prime minister has to start giving some speeches, some serious speeches about the world has changed and we have to change as well. And whether it's national security, whether it's foreign governments meddling in our elections, we still don't have a Foreign Agent Registry Act in this country. The Australians do, the American, you know, like, hello, come on. We've got to get with the program so that, as I mentioned earlier, when a politician in this country says, oh, but, you know, foreign policy isn't big at the front door, well, whose fault is that? So it's got to be the prime minister. It's got to be the foreign minister, Melanie Joly. Now, she's given a couple of speeches. I have some big problems with some of what she said. I much preferred Chrystia Freeland's speech a couple of years ago. I heard Chrystia Freeland on a podcast from Davos, the World Economic Forum, and she was superb. So, you know, we need more Chrystia Freeland in our foreign policy.
And we need more action, not just announcements. I think that is my biggest problem, right? Our politicians unfortunately think that just making announcements is enough, and we need to follow through though.
Okay, but I'm just talking, first you've got to sort of change people's brains about this. Then, yes, we need to spend more money on this. And this was part of why I wanted to come out with a book with a provocative title, Cold War 2.0, that this is serious. We have to take it seriously, and it's going to cost money. So if we go from our 1.3% to 2%, that's an additional 20 billion roughly a year. That's the bare minimum that we have to spend. And depending on who you talk to, the former defense minister was moving in that direction. And now we have a new defense minister who, I don't know where he's going to move. But look, and it's not that I don't believe in pharmacare or I don't believe in a drug plan and so on and so forth. But, and you said it perfectly earlier, if we don't make the down payment on our insurance policy now, the cost in Ukraine is at about $1 trillion so far, just in physical damage. The 500,000 who've died and are wounded and trauma, PTSD for the whole you know, like it's huge. So start by changing some minds, put some serious money in, and then where the two come together, our military, which is already modest at sort of 68,000 active duty, our reserve force is very, very sort of weak. We are short about 15,000 recruits just to keep the 68,000 number. So get this, you may have heard of this. It was on the CBC. We open it up to permanent residents, which is a great idea because Canada does immigration well. So good on us. So let's capitalize that and help build up our military recruitment numbers. 22,000 people apply, which is a great number. 2 years later, 77 have been brought in. And the others, oh, well, you know, we have to run our normal security checks, which takes up to 2 years. Well, 15,000 of those 22,000 who applied said, I can't wait. Who waits 2 years? Like that's just crazy talk. And so they all leave. So this is where, and again, the prime minister sets the tone. If he goes into cabinet one morning and says, I want to see progress on our permanent residency intake, guess what? Those security checks will be done in 3 months. And I'm not saying we should skimp. And I understand, some people are difficult because they have relatives all over the world. But are you telling me in 2024, with all of our high tech and all of our embassies, you can't run a security check in 3 months? I just don't believe it. I just don't believe it.
And
So,
our friends and allies down south have been doing this for ages. I mean, they do accept American permanent residents into their military and provide a faster way for citizenship as a way. And if they can do it, I'm pretty sure we should be able to do it the same. No?
and then the other one, just very granular and specific. You mentioned the sort of mini-lateral sort of sub-alliances, and you mentioned AUKUS. So I spend actually quite a bit of time in one of the chapters talking about AUKUS in the context of, alliances matter, and strategic alliances like AUKUS matter a lot. And in a nutshell, what Australia, the UK, and the US are doing in AUKUS is in a sense pooling their knowledge around nuclear propulsion systems, not the weapons. We have to keep saying this. It's not the weapons. And Australia is going from zero. They don't have a civil nuclear power plant. They don't have any programs in their universities, colleges, and so on. But they get invited into this program. Here we are in Canada. We actually have a lot of capability in nuclear on the civil side. We were actually there in the Oppenheimer film, just not very, visible. But we were the first, and I think to date, still the only country to ever give up nuclear weapons when we could have made them ourselves. But pillar 2 of AUKUS it's as though I wrote the plan. It's artificial intelligence, it's quantum. And again, Canada has good expertise in both of those. And just the other day, like 2 days ago, New Zealand is making noises that, they're thinking hard about joining AUKUS, at least for pillar 2. Canada, like, I was so disappointed when AUKUS announced and there was no C anywhere. And I don't know, it depends who you talk to. Were we invited? Were we not invited? Were we disinvited?
I
But
wasn't
if you
sure whether we were even aware
but,
until the last day, but yeah.
but Balkan, if New Zealand gets into pillar 2 and we're not in, I'm just going to be so ashamed. And just like, who is awake in Ottawa at DND or Global Affairs? Come on, folks, we got to get with the program. Now, it's not going to be cheap. And this is probably why they're not interested. But again, you've got to pick up the pace. You've got to participate. Because what if Trump, and I'll leave you with this thought, he's made noises about NATO and pulling out of NATO and so on and so forth. No one that I've seen yet publicly has said, well, what if Trump actually turns his sights north and says, oh, Trudeau, yeah, you're pretty down below the spending level. I'm pulling out of NORAD. The Americans have Northcom. They actually don't really need NORAD. They like NORAD because the kill zone for the defense with the Patriot missiles becomes Canada. So, like, I get it. But if we wake up one morning and we read that the Trump administration has terminated its participation in NORAD, what do you think that's going to cost? I know they're working on NORAD modernization, which, by the way, is another fear of mine. So for 35 years, I helped the Canadian private sector move from mechanical to digital. It's a heavy lift. It is not simple. It is not easy. You can't just call in, the consultants and have them do it. You've actually got to hire people, back to the recruitment point. And I'm deathly afraid that the Canadian military, under the rubric of interoperability, is just going to say, well, I'll have what the Americans are having. And and I don't want to get too technical, but, I'll have an instance of what the Americans have, but just, on a separate computer down in California or somewhere. And our entanglement on that will be so complete that when Trump says, hey, you guys aren't picking up, your fair share, we are going to be so exposed and so behind the eight ball. So there's another one, the
Yeah, I
whole
mean,
move
yeah,
to digital.
I think the two key things, and I'm going to end it on this note, in the sense that we need political leadership to take this step and talk to the people and get the contracts in and get the bureaucracy moving. Because if we do not do what we need to do today, we will be paying a much, much bigger price across NATO, across NORAD, across other alliances, and here at home in Canada. And I think it is, again, it gets back to the political leadership that we need to do. So George, I'm sure we could actually talk another hour
Yes, we
on
could.
this. Hopefully we'll have you again to the show, but thank you very much for coming to Double Trouble. Once again, you have been watching and listening Double Trouble, a series as a part of Macdonald-Laurier Institute's Inside Policy Talks, which is generously supported by the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation's Canada office. And we hope to see you again in another episode of Double Trouble. Thank you.